Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're here today with us as we get settled in and people start coming into the program. I hope that all of you will share in the chat who you are and where you're joining us from. And also, what are you hoping to learn today? Go ahead and drop that into the chat. As you start doing that, I want to say welcome to today's program covering trans and LGBTQ plus issues during 2024. My name is Bara Vaida. I am the Director of Training at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We're based in Washington, D.C., and our nonprofit organization provides training and support for journalists with the mission of powering journalism in the public interest. I'm so glad to welcome you all to today's program, and I want to say a very big thank you to the Trans Journalists Association, which helped us develop today's program. Before we get started, a few notes. We have a closed captioning option available. If you're joining us on a desktop or a laptop, you can enable this at any time by finding the live transcription button in the navigation menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we're also recording today's program. A link will be mailed to you of the recording, and it will be included in our Monday's newsletter, which is the latest. If you don't already subscribe to our afternoon newsletter on the media, we'll just drop that link in the chat. Please sign up. Today's program is designed as a conversation. We hope you'll join in with your thoughts on the topics our panelists raised today. Please share your questions in the Q&A queue. We recommend putting them there so they don't get lost in the chat. We'll be monitoring those questions and responding to them through the program. And now I want to turn this program over to today's moderator, Gina Chua. She is the executive director at Summit 4, and she will lead us through this conversation. Handing it off to you, Gina. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, I'm Gina. We've got a full program today. I'm really pleased to have three panelists with us. Katie Barnes, who's with ESPN, Lex McMenamin, I think I got that right. Okay, with Teen Vogue, and Phoebe Petrovic. I got that one right, from Wisconsin Watch. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So let me just start first with sort of a framing question about framing questions. And I think that we spend a lot of time thinking about, misinformation. We spend a lot of time thinking about sort of facts being not right in a story, about sources and who we should center in a story. I personally think we have a broader problem, which is how stories are framed. And I'll give you an example, which is if we spend, if we sick a huge investigative team off to look at, what happens if people regret the surgeries they might have or the trans care they might have, that's in some ways a perfectly legitimate story to do. And if you do it completely accurately, you would have revealed some information that's useful. But if you don't spend any time looking at the people who couldn't get care, then you're really kind of missing the point on the story. It's sort of like covering abortion, only looking at women who regret their abortions, which is, again, an important population to look at. But if you don't cover women who couldn't get abortions, then you really kind of miss the point of the story. So I do think a key question as people look at and think about covering trans issues is really about what questions we ask and making sure we ask the right questions, because if we ask the wrong questions, even having the right answers doesn't really get us much further. So I want to just start off with that maybe and ask our panelists what they think through in terms of sort of framing questions. What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong? What could we have less of or more of? And especially in an election year, and especially in a year where support for trans rights and support for LGBT rights in general is dropping among the public. So I don't know, Katie, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will absolutely tackle the very small question first.
Why not? Why not?
So my lens is dominated by sports. ESPN is the most aggressively sports-driven outlet in the country. And so for me, one of the things that I think about is that, we're in 2024, the first piece of legislation that affected transgender youth in sports passed in 2020. And so a lot of these states have had these laws on the books for multiple years. And one of the questions I keep asking myself is, what's been happening in these states? What are the experiences of the youth who are affected by this legislation? There are lawsuits, but not in everyone. Policy is an evolving place. And I always like to ask why, like who's being listened to, who's driving the conversation. And that to me, it really helps get into some of these larger policy questions that aren't very boring. I think in the sports world, what I have seen in terms of this evolving policy space and legislative space, the way that it's typically approached is through a predominantly like political lens. It's covered like a partisan horse race and not as broader sports questions and broader policy questions. And I feel like that's been a really significant missing piece in the last 4 years, 5 years. And it's something that I hope is addressed more broadly moving forward.
Thanks, Katie. Lex?
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm trying to think about going into this year, just because I felt like, and for context, I'm like the politics editor here at Teen Vogue, where I also handle most of our day-to-day like news blogging. I handle our long form reportage. I'm kind of a mixed bag in terms of what I end up writing, and then I also edit stuff, which is all to say, like, one day I can be covering these bills, the next day it's campus protests, you name it. But something, since I've been trying to keep an eye on this particular beat of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation in state houses for 2 years now, this year going into 2024, I'm actually thinking a lot about how many of those bills are not passing, and how many of those bills are failing to become law, and how many of them are being really effectively challenged within state houses, whether that's by like organizing contingents that are, you know, adult based, like whether it's advocacy orgs that are local on the ground in those states, whether it's working with national advocacy groups that are helping them to create an infrastructure in states where maybe those weren't in existence already, or even if it's, you know, like less official organizing contingents, whether it's like parent teacher boards or students showing up to school board meetings, or, you know, that on the very micro local level. But we are seeing that a lot of these policies are not actually coming to fruition. And so the headlines of these like big numbers of record numbers of bills proposed in state house across the country are not necessarily having the same material impacts because they're just frankly not that popular. They also are not necessarily the highest priority of a lot of the conservative agendas as we're facing 2024, and whether that's because the last 7 months of war has really kind of shifted the litmus for priorities or not, it's hard to say, but it is certainly coming across that regardless of how much fervor is being built and how certain politicians will like proudly claim that policy agenda as something that they think will go viral when they talk about it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's like having the material impact or will necessarily even be capable of becoming legislation by the time we're looking at November, right? And so that's something I'm trying to keep in mind while I have the luxury of always being able to prioritize student like conversations and conversations with young people as my focus point, because I'm at Teen Vogue and I know not everybody has that like very specific framing, but at least in terms of like how I'm presenting these conversations to sources and also like what stories I raise, I'm trying to keep that in the back of my mind for the next couple of months.
Okay. I'll come back to that in a sec, but let's go over to Phoebe.
Yeah, so I think there's two main kind of framing ideas that I would want to impart. One is that trans people are a tiny minority of the population, like 1 to 3% of the American population, who face significant outsized marginalization, and that varies depending on whether someone is like a cis-passing white trans person or a trans woman of color, particularly Black trans woman. And so, like, I think that is just a really important thing to keep in mind when we do this sort of coverage, because we have been like a tiny minority of the population getting so much attention, and often not pointing out, not thinking about like, oh yeah, there's another side to this. So if someone doesn't get access to trans care at all, what does that look like? So that framing is really essential for figuring out how we can broaden our coverage, because the stakes are so high and the group is so small. And that's especially elevated when we're talking about children and young people who might be subjected to unsafe or unwelcoming conditions at home or at school. related to that, when we talk about trans healthcare is held to a much higher standard than all other forms of healthcare. So when we talk about low quality evidence for particular standards of care or gender affirming care, low quality evidence doesn't mean what a layman person might think that it might mean. It doesn't mean that it's, what it means is that it wasn't a randomized control double-blind study, which is unethical to do in something like gender affirming care. So that's kind of related to that. The other big thing is, I think it's important to be thinking about as we're telling these stories, whether that's rollback of LGBTQ protections at school boards or in healthcare or in sports, like what is the larger project that this is attached to, that it's not coming out of a vacuum, that it's often funded by the same groups who often have Christian nationalist theocratic agendas, who were pushing gay panic in the 70s. It's the same groups over time, the same sources of money, the same moral panic that is like recast and rebranded for today. And so keeping that in mind, that it's that you might be working on this story that is about this particular this particular group, but these are the same sort of anxieties about religion, sex, gender, race that we have in this like white supremacist society that we've had for a long time. And so being able to kind of see those connections, even if you're not able to elevate them in your story, it's important just for like getting the lay of the land and determining when you're going to weigh in.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, in fact, it is a good point, first of all, that we are a very small part of the population, but also the bills affect a lot of non-trans people, right? The bathroom bills generally have been catching masculine cis women. And so in fact that, that there's actually there's a different population at risk as well. And the point about sort of the standards of care for, the standards at which trans care is held up to is a really important one. If you look at regret rates for gender affirming care, it tends to sort of float around 1 to 4%, or at least detransition rates or desistance rates. And regret rates for knee surgery, hover in the 30% range, right? And that's a very important piece of context. But I want to come back to, as you pointed out, a lot of things affect children here. A lot of the bills, whether they're in schools, whether on social transition or care, are targeted at children. Children are a particularly hard group of people to cover well. I mean, perhaps you all could reflect on your experiences and tips on how you can manage to reach out and make sure that those experiences and those voices are in your stories, and sort of the ethical issues that need to be thought about. I mean, Phoebe, do you want to go first, and we'll run it backwards to down the list?
Yeah, so this will vary depending on your newsroom and what your own editorial standards are for whether you're able to quote minors without parental consent. In our organization, we're not allowed to do that. So we have to have parental consent, which makes things tricky in a situation where you might have a young trans person who is not in a safe or supportive home. Their parent isn't necessarily going to give them consent to talk about this. So that's something to keep in mind, and is a problem, and is where we need research. We need studies to be able to point to sort of elevate kids' perspectives. But one of the things that I did for a story on what gender affirming care looked like in Wisconsin for trans youth, I wanted to tell that story through the lens of trans youth themselves at different stages of development. And parents were a really essential part in being able to spend time with those young people. And so I had long conversations first with parents who had young children who were undergoing gender affirming care, a 6-year-old, 12-year-old, 16-year-olds, and had those conversations first with them, and then set up those conversations with the young people afterwards. And so, what was helpful for me in those instances was reaching out to community groups and advocacy groups that work with specifically LGBTQ youth. In Wisconsin, we have a great group called GSAFE that works to support LGBTQ youth acceptance in schools, they know everyone, and they know people across the state. And so I was able to come to them and say, hey, I'm working on this project. I want to be able to feature the experiences of young people themselves. And they were able to spread that message to their networks. I also found Facebook groups were really helpful for me. And I reached out specifically to the moderators of those Facebook groups so that I wasn't lurking in a space that I wasn't supposed to be in, or that would, make that space uncomfortable or unwelcoming for the people who needed that community support. But reaching out to the moderators to say, hey, this is who I am, this is my past reporting, this is the project I'm working on. You can ask me any questions about my process. Please share my request or entreaty with other people. That was really effective because that's how family members reached out to me specifically to say, I really want to tell you about my kid's story. And then, the best part of that reporting was we just hung out in a park, with a first grader for a long time. And they were telling me about how they wanted to be the first non-binary kid astronaut. And it was really fun. But I think going about it intentionally, respectfully, reaching out to trusted adults and supportive adults was the way that I found most success, recognizing that there are lots of nuances there. But yeah, I'll stop talking.
That's good. Lex?
Sorry, I was finding the unmute button. I don't have a ton of wheel reinventing to do from what Phoebe just shared, because I also follow best practices of reaching out to legitimate organizations to connect with sources that way. Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I am typically talking to young folks. I do a lot of reporting on college level young people, so not exclusively minors, but it is quite common for me to interview minors, which we also do require adult guardian parent sign off in order to do so. But yeah, this is the one issue where that tends to get a little spicy. The positive of reaching out to organizations is that to Phoebe's point, you're already making sure that the group of sources you're going to are not necessarily going to be hostile or putting child in a difficult situation in order to be put in contact for a story. But yeah, to Phoebe's point, if say you're someone that's in a state that doesn't have a really large infrastructure of LGBTQ advocacy organizations, Google is your bestie. Literally just typing your state in and then queer, and because I've had to do that. I used to live in New Hampshire, which I don't know if you guys know anything about New Hampshire, because most people don't. But yeah, it's also really hard to connect with LGBTQ organizations there, but going very basic in the same way that you would if you were looking for resources as a queer person or as a trans person is actually not the rocket science of finding you the correct sources. The one thing I'll also say, beyond just the logistics, but the thought process of which sources and how and why you are connecting with, as Phoebe was speaking, I was thinking about that New York Times story from last summer where they decided to profile a support group of unsupportive parents of trans kids and give that mic without talking to any of the children of those unsupportive parents, and that was kind of their this is our way of unbiased commentary on this subject. I thought that was a really incredibly biased approach. It already took a standpoint just by virtue of saying that the voices that would be prioritized are parents who have negative experiences, as opposed to what Gina was saying earlier, actually allowing the people directly impacted to speak their truth. But I'm starting to hear more and more from folks on local papers that that type of story thinking is being treated as not biased, when I think it in fact very much so is. And so I just want to raise that as there are bad ways to do this, and trans journalists notice when you publish them, and it would be great if we could minimize that. So that'll be the end of my
I would point out that story starts off with an anecdote of a mother who says, I found out because my child's, because the school sent back homework with a different name. And of course, 11 paragraphs down, the kid says, they actually do talk to the child, and the child says, I tried to tell my parents, but they wouldn't listen.
Clearly.
Which is kind of a contradiction in a story that you'd think an editor would have caught. Katie, you also have to deal with a lot of children, or at least, with minors in the stories. How do you handle it?
Yeah, I do. I interview a lot of kids. Since my entree into this topic is largely through the sports legislation that almost always affects children. So I don't necessarily have anything that is particularly reinventing the wheel. The one thing I will say is that when it comes to interviewing families who, at least for much of the time when I get to them, they aren't necessarily media trained. They aren't necessarily familiar with journalists. And so I really center agency for them, right? Like, I tell them that they have every right to set a boundary, and I will adhere to that. And I center, their own comfort. They want their lawyer there, great. They want their grandmother there, fantastic. It doesn't bother me who's in the room. If it's, for that person's comfort. I will ask, my job is to ask questions, and, they will answer them however they, see fit. And that includes maybe not answering a question. When that happens, it's up to me as an experienced journalist to then pivot away from that in a way that isn't disruptive, right? If they set a boundary, adhere to it, maybe you can come back to it later. But there's no need for that to kind of like blow up an interview. The other thing that I will say is that, when interviewing kids, and especially this is coming from the lens where I'm almost always doing that through the exploration of legislation and its effects, or possible policy and its effects, or sometimes some kind of a traumatic experience. And I've interviewed, kids as young as 9. And I don't really ask them about how they feel about legislation necessarily, just because, one, I don't know that they're going to give a good answer, and 2, like, that's just a very hard question for a 9-year-old to respond to. What I want to know is what their favorite ice cream is, what their favorite, subject in school is, how sports makes them feel, like, and really bringing that person to life as, a character or subject of my story. I find that parents are often way better storytellers in that regard, from a effective policy perspective. And so I really think about and am intentional around what kinds of questions I ask which members of the family that I'm speaking to. And part of that process is weighing how the effects of those questions may affect them, especially children. And that's where I tread with the most caution.
Well, you talked about the families not being media trained, and there's a question in the Q&A, which I'll sort of reframe a bit to fit into this. I mean, you're placed in a particular sort of position of responsibility, in the sense that you probably have a better understanding of how, publication of somebody's details, their life might affect them, especially in communities that are not supportive. How do you balance those sorts of responsibilities to both sort of tell a story and tell it with authentic people, and ideally with real identities, so people can see that these are not anonymous voices? How do you think about how you protect people while also telling the stories? And whichever one of you want to pick that up, dive in.
I'll go first. Working in a very large outlet is something I think about all the time. It's not a small amount of people. Even if it's a low page view count, for us, it's larger than a lot of other outlets, right? So something I think about a lot, or I've done stories for television, and it's a similar sort of conversation. And one of the things that I do is I never minimize, the risk. I'm honest, and sometimes that means that people don't want to participate, and I understand that, and I move on. The other thing that I do is, my starting point is almost always with families who have already been public, or who are out there in some way. So I might start with plaintiffs in a lawsuit, and sometimes they say no for a variety of reasons. Or if they've been present in local coverage, then I'm like, okay, well, I can delve into this story a little bit more for national piece. And so I sort of start there. I don't necessarily preference new voices or news stories unless I feel like they've been really overdone. And then, if a family requests, being anonymous, or a pseudonym, I fight really hard for that. And the tenor of the conversation, at least over the time that I've been covering these stories, has changed significantly. And so my first story about transgender athletes came out in 2018, after almost 2 years of reporting, with two very public transgender athletes. In the years since, it's gotten increasingly more difficult in terms of not using pseudonyms, and families not wanting to be anonymous. They don't want to be public in the same way. And part of my job as a reporter is to understand why, and then to manage that effectively with my editors and their managers. Because it's not necessarily about advocating for a community per se, but it's about understanding the real safety concerns through well-documented incidents that have already happened. So that's kind of how I handle it.
All right, thanks. Either of you, Lex, Phoebe, want to jump in on that?
I am muted first, and then if you want to go after me, Phoebe, so I can say what I was gonna say just really fast.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, I am fortunate to be getting harassed all the time, by which I mean I am fortunate to have great ability to express the risks to my sources, and also, like, frankly, like, to Katie's point, like, Teen Vogue is also a national publication that like has a lot more readership than the average like local paper. People also like love to hate Teen Vogue in particular, whether it's because of like misogyny or like a general culture that like despises the concept that young people need like news for themselves to be able to like have critical thought. But so like this is all like to say that our sources often get harassed just by virtue of being in Teen Vogue, let alone whether it's not about trans stuff, and then you add trans stuff, and so then it's like to like sort of buttress what Katie was saying, we quite regularly offer anonymity or pseudonyms or first name only or any number of alternatives for young people to be able to participate, because the safety risks just seem really, really high. I don't know that all outlets have like fact-checking capacity to the extent that Teen Vogue does, because I'm hearing more and more that national publications don't have fact checkers. I don't know if that's true for local all around, but like certainly I hear that a lot. And so the fact checking process is what makes it easier for us to do things like that, offer anonymity. But like I said, because we're at like a youth focused publication, we will always prioritize safety over like pretty much any other call.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that, just in terms of brass tacks process, I shared the story in the chat, but for every interview I had with a family or young person, I had just an introductory call first where I explained myself, what I was doing, what my process was, and explained the potential risks and what we were able to offer them, and what we couldn't promise and what we could promise about anonymity, where it might go. I talked about, this is for us, for our conversations, this is what on background means, off the record, whatever. This is our fact-checking process. I love working at Wisconsin Watch because like our fact-checking process is built into our editorial process. It's the one like local outlet where it's really strict about that. It's wonderful. But having that, and so I explained all of that, and they got to ask me questions, and then I was like, okay, now you can sit with that and decide whether or not you want to proceed. And then we had those interviews afterwards. And so I think breaking that up was really key. Whereas most of the time, especially when you're on the fly, on deadline, maybe something less sensitive, you're having that conversation at the beginning of your interview. But I felt it was really important to be like, okay, you think about this as a parent, you talk to your child about this and whether or not they want to participate, and then we'll go from there. And then we worked with a really great photographer who took really wonderful photos in that piece. And one thing we don't normally do, but we did for this, was we shared those photographs with the mom beforehand to say, hey, which ones are you comfortable with us publishing? Because we had agreed we were going to take photographs that wouldn't show faces, but what we find identifiable versus what a person themselves finds identifiable and comfortable is different. So that was a really important part of the process to me, sharing those photographs ahead of time so that they gave consent as to which ones felt comfortable. And then like even in the cut lines, I had a producer on our team like identified the name of the park. And I was like, oh, no, we're not going to do that because that, it's close to their house, bad idea. So it comes up in all steps of the process, but yeah, I think being really communicative about your process is really important, all the way up through publication.
Right. I want to take a really quick question myself and just try to move this conversation on. There was a question about how do people who are parents and whether any of us are parents, how does that affect how we think about it? And I'll just say I've got two kids who are grown, but I understand what parents feel like, right? And you're always worried about your child, and I understand why reporters, especially who have young children and who's thinking the children have, dealt with a lot of things, COVID and so on, and are anxious. And I can see how it drives some of the unconscious bias. The only thing I would say about that is it exists. I know it. I'm a parent. But the one thing I always say is like when your kid tells you they're gay or they're trans or whatever, like please don't ever say no matter I'll love you no matter what. Because the bias is so implicit, and if you ask yourself, if you say to yourself as a reporter, that's something I might say to my kid. Just ask yourself, if your kid had come to you and said, I just got into Harvard with a full boat scholarship, and you say, you know what, I love you no matter what. I think that tells you where your head is, right? So, and you should think about that. I completely understand that you worry but you can't project your worries of your kids on your stories because that's not fair. And you should, in any case, ask yourself why you might say those words to your child because it tells you what you think of gay people or any other group that you might have said that to. I want to pivot a little bit over, unless you guys have something you want to jump in on that. I want to pivot over to really a question about working. Partly, I want to take a question and sort of expand it. So the question is really about how do you work with or interact with explicitly anti-trans groups, especially if you're a trans reporter, but whether you are or you aren't, how you work with groups like that and talk to them, because obviously to some extent you want their side of the story. But I think more broadly, I would love to ask you all also, how do you handle, if you like, both sides? Or the other side? How do you handle misinformation that's given to you? And how do you deal with it in a story? If somebody says something or a politician says something, it's a quote, it's on the record, everyone's talking about it, it's false. What do you do? What's your go-to method? Again, whoever wants to pick this one up.
I actually wanted to say like ideally 2 sentences about the previous question.
Go for it.
And
Go.
the
Sorry.
next question over to everybody else, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool, because frankly, I won't have a ton of answers on the next question.
Okay,
The only thing I was gonna say is I am from a pretty non-traditional family, so I'm like also a caregiver for young people in my family, though I'm not a biological, I've not, given birth or anything like that. But I do, like, there are children in my life that I am responsible for. And the only thing I wanted to say about like how that impacts my coverage is that I actually let them give me story ideas all the time. And I think it's like really helpful, frankly. Like, I think that the thing that makes me an accountable journalist to young people is that I like will sit and talk with them, like, what's coming up at school? Like, what are you seeing on TikTok? Like, where are things coming? Like, you have questions because if you're a parent, young people are going to, like, your kids have questions for you. And wouldn't you rather they get those answers from someone taking them in good faith rather than like a hostile schooling environment or a media environment that has the worth-based impression of where those questions are coming from, or like something that is extrapolating a bias onto like where the questions even come up. So the only thing I was going to say is, like, as a parent, feel liberated to like just have a normal conversation with your kid, and it actually might help your coverage in a way you wouldn't have expected, because otherwise why would they be talking about it? But that's it.
Thank you. Katie or Phoebe, on the other question about dealing with misinformation, dealing with anti-trans groups as part of your coverage.
I'm happy to take this one.
Go for it.
So a few things for me. The first is that I firmly believe that when an issue or topic is controversial, air quotes, that means there's inherently multiple perspectives. I think sometimes we get bogged down as journalists into quote unquote both sides stuff. And the reality is, at least in my world, on the topics I cover that pertain to the trans community, there are multiple perspectives and multiple sides. And I think it's really important to capture the essence of the questions that are being answered and do my best to try to questions that are being asked and do my best to try to answer those questions. And one of those core questions is, where does the legislation come from? And so I need to answer that question. And I know very clearly where the legislation has come from. And I think it's important to be really intentional about who you're talking to and why. And I think this is true no matter who you're talking to about this topic, right? Like, for example, if I am writing a story about the effects of legislation restricting transgender girls' ability to participate in girls and women's sports across the country, I'm really interested in talking to somebody who's been affected by that legislation, not just a trans person who plays community level sports. That's a different story than the one that I'm after, right? And so if I'm also interested in then knowing where the legislation came from, or quote unquote the other side, then I want to call up the bill sponsor. I want to know who wrote the bill. And I want to know who they consulted with, and then want to call up who they consulted with. And I think it's really important that I be able to execute that part of my job. And for me as a journalist, that means that, frankly, like the Alliance Defending Freedom needs to pick up the phone when I call, and they need to trust that they will be treated fairly, and that what their perspective will be communicated accurately and honestly. And so I spend a lot of time managing, all of my relationships with all of my sources. And that includes people whose opinions and perspectives differ greatly from my own. And it's a challenge, but it's an essential part of the job. I really fully do believe that, or at least part of my job as somebody who writes for a very mainstream sports media outlet. The other part of that equation in terms of misinformation is also thinking about, what is the point of the interview that I am conducting? It's not my job to change a person's mind or even to necessarily correct them in most of the settings in which I'm conducting an interview. If I'm doing an interview that's for television, it's a little bit different. But in general, if I am asking somebody why they feel XYZ way about, or why they chose to write this bill in this way, and they answer that, and their perspective is incorrect, some of that is just anchored in reporting and then presenting the facts around what is communicated. Some of it is choosing not to print what is said because it's not true. And that is also, that level of veracity is something that I apply everywhere, to all perspectives on this issue, and not just around one perspective over another. And I think one of the reasons why we struggle industry-wide to cover this topic is that in many ways we have a different level of veracity for different parts of this conversation, and that is deeply problematic.
One really quick follow-up before we go to Phoebe and back to Lex. So somebody's put a question in. So Katie, do you also talk to the cis kids who feel affected by these bills?
I actually do. So for example, I have interviewed the plaintiffs in Connecticut multiple times. If you read my book, you will see a section I dedicated about 500 words from Riley Gaines in particular. So if there is a documented instance where there are cisgender kids, talking about this, I absolutely include that perspective. Like in Connecticut, for example, there were petitions, like there are plaintiffs. So like in that sense, yeah, I talk to them. And I will also say that more and more increasingly, there are these various perspectives. But I think if you look at like how I covered Leah Thomas, you will see that all of those perspectives are represented across the board. And I think it's also fair to say that one of the perspectives that's actually not covered a lot is when we think about athletes, as we think about the issue as being the trans kids who are affected, or the trans athletes who are affected, and then the cisgender women who oppose them. There are like a whole bunch of cisgender women who are supportive. And so that perspective is left out pretty frequently as well.
Or even don't care. Like, or just like don't.
Oh yeah. Like also like who literally don't care. I think one of the most interesting perspectives that I engaged with in reporting on Leah Thomas, for example, who's a transgender swimmer from the University of Pennsylvania, who won a national championship in 2022, was at the 2022 swimming championships. A lot of the women who were competing were just like pissed that all of this media was there covering this controversy who didn't care about them previously and would not care about them the following year. And that was something that I really took to heart, because I felt that that was a very fair criticism of media and of national media. And so the following season, I wrote one of my favorite pieces ever about the University of Virginia swimming team, which is just a dominant force in the sport. And so I went back and talked to a lot of those women about something that they really did care about. And I think that in general, we as journalists see this topic, particularly around transgender athletes, as just like from a very narrow point of view. And my experience is that it's much broader and much wider than any of us give it credit for.
Sorry, Phoebe, let's get to you.
Yeah, I want to second everything Katie said, because I think, yeah, I really don't have much to add, other than I think one thing in misinformation about anything, but in trans sports and healthcare in particular, things get really mushed together, right? So I sat at a panel about a sports bill, a sports ban, and they were, the legislator held up a piece of paper and was like, this is science. You can't refute this. This is science about wingspan and bone density and all this stuff. The bill was about K-12 sports. And, looking at the data that she was pointing to, it was about cis adult men to cis adult women, and differences between the two. When we're talking about people who haven't gone through puberty yet, or going through puberty and haven't, or might be going through gender affirming care and all of this stuff. So just to be able to like tease that stuff out, so that we're dealing with what we're talking about, what we're actually talking about, I think is really important. Also, I mean, as with anything, you have to represent yourself and your community and industry well as like a professional, polite journalist. People will be looking to see if you are biased or to catch you being dismissive or whatever. And so just taking the professionalism and the care that you do that you extend to anyone, you have to extend it to everyone. And I think also, with that example of that document, I think it illustrates the difference between facts and feelings, and listening to someone and being like, I hear your feelings, I hear your concerns, let me talk about them. And then also let's show in the story, what the science says. And, I think those are two kind of ways to handle it. And I just want to like boost Katie's point about these phenomenal athletes being really upset about like the cynical concern for women's sports. I think that kind of like that's it. That's all I want to say.
Okay. Lex, you had a quick point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I obviously don't have too much to add. All the besties know what they're talking about. The only thing I was going to say is that there is like in the limited examples where I do get to like poke at bad faith anti-trans folks, because I'll admit to being biased against anti-trans folks because I'm allowed to do that at my job. Sorry, folks. But we can't all work at Team Vogue, I guess. But so I did like this big package last year about Florida, because obviously DeSantis was such a air sucking politician last year, and I really didn't want to continue writing about his policies, especially for like, as I mentioned up top, like a lot of them aren't fully going into place. A lot of them are just for him to make like headlines for the purposes of his campaigning, which is no longer even like relevant, but at the time was like the kerfuffle, right? And so not that I think you should all sit and read this incredibly long form package I put together, but what I wanted to say was I built each story around a thing DeSantis had said, a policy DeSantis had proposed, or like something that had been supported by an individual like Chris Rufo, like people that are within his like state administration, and then made sure that I just had like a source that would actually be living under those policies or living within those institutions or attend the school where he sent Chris Rufo in to be suddenly a part of the administration, though he doesn't live in Florida, at every stage of those. So like, I think something Katie was saying, and then probably Phoebe echoed, is like, yeah, we don't have to repeat stuff people say that is like factually untrue, disinformation, misinformation, but it like sourcing is like the most ideal way, I feel, to like actually like make interventions on things that people are saying and repeating loudly, if you do have to say them at all, because it just goes to show like you don't have to be doing analysis. Do you know what I mean? Like when you're left with here's something one person said and then here's someone else's lived experience, like the only conclusions you can draw are just based around like what's left after that, right? So that was it.
I want to just go back to a quick point about what Katie had said earlier, which is sort of understanding the intention of Bill and the analogy I always give is when Texas, pre-Dobbs, unless they're admitting rights to a hospital within 30 miles. I mean, we did not spend a ton of time looking at, gee, would this really help maternal health care in Texas? We understood the purpose of this bill and you covered it that way. I'm sure somebody actually did say it doesn't make any difference to maternal health care, but I think it's important to understand the true purposes behind a lot of these bills, as opposed to simply taking a statement on faith and, I will deliberately go out and fact check them. We're running at the 15-minute mark, so we're going to try and move quickly through a couple of, I got basically going to try and squeeze in 2 questions if I can. So the first one, I think, really is the bias issue, which has come up again as a question, which sort of, basically says that the Time story we talked about clearly had a bias, but how do you report stories without bias? And there's slightly different ways that, how do you think about bias in stories, and how do you work through those issues as you are thinking about stories, or as you're reading other people's stories and want to give, I think, advice to others about how to approach stories without the kind of bias that we've seen. I have thoughts, but I will let you all go first, whoever wants to go. Bias? No? Question? Anyone want to take that?
I will go.
Yeah, go on, Katie. You're the star.
So I think the reality is that everybody has bias. Like there's just no way around that in terms of the kinds of stories that you want to write, the people that you reach out to, the stories that are greenlit by editors, the sentences that you choose, the quotes you select, all of those things are informed by what we think are important, like what we think is important. And that is a form of bias. I think instead of striving for something that is, quote, unbiased, I always strive for fairness and accuracy. And that means, accurately reflecting what the policy is that I'm covering, accurately reflecting the variety of experiences of the athletes in question, accurately reflecting the perspectives of the people who are seeking to change the policy, if that is what's happening, and those who are seeking to keep it the same, right? And so I really strive for that. And I'm very open and honest about my approach with everyone that I talk to. And I think also in my case, it's been very interesting in that my approach to journalism has not changed, but the accusations of bias that are leveled toward me have considerably. And it's largely rooted in my identity. And it's something, and also the fact that I work for an outlet that draws attention. And so those two things together have made me very sensitive to how what I say will be portrayed or received. And I also wrote a book where I take a position on the issue. I explain my viewpoint. I had 3,000 words or so to do it, but I'm on the record as having a perspective. And so in some ways that's actually liberating and freeing, in that, I can sort of say, like I'm a known quantity in that regard, and the ability for me to do that, and I think still be able to do what I do journalistically, is the longevity I have in this space. And so those are things that I'm constantly grappling with, and that I don't want to be misunderstood. And I have a body of work that kind of defends my approach. But I think in a general sense, instead of seeking objectivity or being bias-free, things that are unbiased, like those are ideas that mean something different to everybody. I really focus on being fair and accurate. And okay. I think if you do those things, you can be very successful.
Lex, Phoebe?
So the only thing fair and accurate are the two things that I often lift up, and instead, because we all have a perspective that we bring to the work, it's, it's impossible to it's just inherent to being human. But I will say, and I've talked about this with my editors, that I think that when you read my work, it's clear that we are coming at this with the perspective, the radical perspective that trans people are human and that they deserve rights and respect and decency, just like every other type of person. And there are people in this world, some of them that we write about or have to talk to, who don't hold that perspective. And so that is a place in which we might be accused of bias. But I think it's an honorable and defensible position to say trans people are people, and they deserve rights as well. And then where that comes up is things like examining gender affirming healthcare and saying, okay, why is it that this type of healthcare in particular is held to a much higher standard when the level of evidence, the level of investigation is far superior than you might find in things like other general pediatrics? Like, what is the difference here? And sort of pointing that out.
Thanks. Lex?
Nope.
No? Okay, all right. Well, I'll give my quick 2 cents while you guys think about a final farewell quick question, which is like one takeaway. So, I want a 1 minute takeaway from each of you for the, but I will just say two things on my side, which is Katie's right about everything here, but Katie's absolutely right about we all have our blind spots and we all have our biases. And so, and part of it is to think through what we consider normal and what we understand. And the way I tend to do it is through analogy. I gave a talk at the Logan Symposium recently, and I sort of said, like, look at all the tens of thousands of words that look at, question basically whether, trans people can really, really know if they're trans, and, are we too troubled, and are we too young, and are we too immature to really understand ourselves? And so I just asked the audience, like, so how do you know you're cis or straight? Like, was there a traumatic experience that made you heterosexual? And if you can ask those questions, it makes it clear to people what they're asking. And I think constantly interrogating yourself, or having your editors or your coworkers interrogate yourself about, let's just substitute a different word here and see if this question makes sense. I was asked at the NLGJA conference last year, like, yeah, this is a nice panel, but like, give me a quick takeaway. And my quick takeaway was, you write your story, wherever you see the word trans, put the word abortion, then reread your story. And if your story reads fine, then you are in good shape. And if your story reads really oddly, this is not a story you would have written about abortion, or this is not how you would have talked about abortion care, then maybe you should ask yourself why you I'll give one really quick example. There was a story recently published in a newspaper, which I will not name, that was writing about the cash report, and it said basically 43 out of 44 patients on minors on puberty blockers went on gender affirming care, raising the question of whether that treatment was having its desired effect of letting them have enough time to decide if they were really trans. And so that sentence went in, written by a senior reporter, edited doubtless by a zillion editors. And I took that and I sent it to a friend at that publication. And I said, look, let's just rewrite that sentence. 43 out of 44 women who were given comprehensive counseling about abortion went on to have an abortion, raising questions about whether counseling and giving people full information about an abortion was having its desired effect. And that's, again, you would never write that sentence about abortion, but you seem perfectly happy to write that sentence about trans care. And so you might want to ask yourself why that is. Anyway, I've now hogged the spotlight for a while, so I'm going to go to each of you in turn and have your nice 1 or 2 minute, I think we just have time for 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minute takeaway that you would like the audience to walk away with. Who wants to go first? Oh, come on.
Trans people are people. show everyone grace and respect as you're reporting. Try to hear, like, doing stories about trans people, hear from trans people, especially the ones who are directly impacted by whatever we're talking about, and ask them what coverage they need, what coverage they want, what coverage would help them navigate their lives better, or what they believe would help other people learn about them, because people might not know about a trans person unless they read about it in the newspaper. And the type of coverage you do will vary, whether you're an investigative reporter at a local outlet, you're working at Teen Vogue or ESPN. But I think always, what are you thinking about? What do you want to hear about? What should I be covering? It's a good thing to ask.
Okay. Katie, Lex?
I'll go just so Katie can be last, since Katie's been on
Yeah,
the
let's
ship
do
during
that.
this call. While Gina, as you've been making the abortion comparison, I'm like, I read so much shitty reporting on abortion all the time. I wish I knew the great abortion reporters. You're like, I wish they all were making great money. But the point I wanted to make was that none of this is set in stone, and also a lot of this, like, which I say to be like, so if you're being told by your bosses that, like, oh, we have this style guide, da 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 da, like, let's all look at 2020 and the fact that entire newsrooms had to go through entire upheavals to, like, even acknowledge how people of color are undermined in their newsrooms, right? That was not like 10 years ago. That was within, like, blinking distance for all of us. And so, like, and like trans people, just like people of color, just like women, are people. And so, like, journalism will continue having to catch up to the reality of, like, how it's done a poor job in the past, and how everything will have to continuously be constructed to do better in the future. And in terms of, somebody in the Q&A was like, what's your favorite thing to ask like LGBTQ youth? And kind of taking it back to what Phoebe was saying, like, everybody's last interview question should always be like, what do I need to know about this that we didn't talk about yet? Like, what should I write about next? What am I not thinking of? Like, what did I not bring up? That's just as much the case with this issue as any other. And, like, as long as that's how you're approaching your interviews, then I feel like you're doing a good job, right? So, Katie.
Katie, over to you.
Dear Lord. Takeaway. I've had so much time to think about this, and yet here I am struggling. I think something to say about writing about trans athletes in particular is that it requires, journalists to simultaneously be sports writers, science writers, and political writers all at the same time. And we all have our strengths and weaknesses in each of those things. But the important part is to, do the work and commit yourself to being better in each of those areas every single time. And I feel like sometimes as journalists, we can get so overwhelmed with the amount of work that we have to do. And everybody is understaffed, everybody's underpaid. Like, it can be so hard to be in this job right now. But I have never regretted putting in a little bit more effort to make my story just a little bit better. And that for me is, I think, just like the one thing I hadn't said that I think is really important.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to hand this back to Bara. Bara, come back on screen.
All right. I just want to say thank you all so much. This conversation was terrific and so thoughtful. I learned so much from you all about just how to think about framing this topic. And I know the viewers did too. There's been some great comments in the chat. And I want to thank the Trans Journalists Association again for helping us put this program together. And as a reminder to everybody, we will be sharing a link to the recording this afternoon, along with resources that were mentioned during this conversation via email. And please go back. You can mine this conversation again for guidance. And I want to thank you all again for taking your time to be here today and your interest in this topic and the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And we hope that you'll join us for future programs here at the Institute. Thank you again, and wishing you a great rest of your Friday.